So I guess there were two things in my growing up and development that were really critical to the kind of scholar I became. The most fundamental was I grew up living between two countries, between Japan and the US. So culture was always a bit of a mystery to me, something that I had to actively investigate in order to understand and participate effectively. And that's why I became a cultural anthropologist, because people often say we study the things we don't understand, and so decoding culture was a big part of my growing up and became a big part of my professional identity. The other important influence in my life was my family, and my brother in particular, who got turned on to new digital technology at a really early age. So I grew up in a context where we had the very first Apple II, and I remember the dial-up modem and going on to BBSs. And my brother kind of kept me in the loop with the evolution of digital technology and online culture, even though probably temperamentally I would have never gotten into it on my own. But I think our relationship really enabled us to sort of build a connection across a sort of orientation and expertise that we wouldn't necessarily have had. And I've always been the person who has worked with my brother in understanding issues around culture and society that I don't think he would have naturally gravitated towards without our close relationship. I think the highest level description is I'm a cultural anthropologist who studies practices around digital technology with a focus on youth culture. That has meant a lot of different things in terms of actual communities and topics and technologies I've studied. I've done a lot of work in both Japan and the US, and mostly focused on online communities and how young people participate in affinity groups, whether that's gaming or fandom. But I've also looked at things like mobile phone use and those more everyday kind of communication practices. Yeah, so thinking back in the growth of the field, I mean, I've been really lucky because I was there from the early days. And the first exposure I had to the study of online communities was really in the day of text-based MUDs, MOOs, MUSHs, and the early studies of bulletin board systems. So this was all text communication. Back then I was interning at Xerox PARC, so some of the first work coming out was around the Lambda Moo and the other experiments that were happening there. But I was also very influenced by work on bulletin boards. So Howard Rheingold's Virtual Community was obviously one of the first books that reached the popular audience and gave awareness to these growing communities. And then along the way, there have been a growing number of studies that have brought in different communities. I think the gaming work around multiplayer online games have obviously been huge, and that area continues to grow. And I was also lucky to be part of the early mobile communication studies as it was growing. So Rich Ling's work on mobile communication was some of the first that was really signaling to the world that this was really a new space of online community, but a community that looked really different from the nerd communities and so on that were sort of the focus of the internet-based communities. So participatory learning is an interesting term because it kind of sat between some of the research that Henry Jenkins has been known for quite some time around participatory culture that was grounded in fan culture and how people in their everyday lives and their communities appropriated, remixed, took on culture and content worlds from popular culture. So that was one stream. And then the other stream, which is actually the area that I was trained in education, was practice-based and sociocultural approaches to education, where folks like Jean Lave talked about learning as participation rather than learning as pushing content into people's heads. So it was really about that shift to understanding learning as social and embodied and part of the lives of communities. And I think the term participatory learning was, in a way, a molding of those two communities that developed in quite different ways. We're actually starting to use the term connected learning a lot more because I think participatory learning really focus on the act of participating in a social group and how learning was part of that. Connected learning is kind of pushing towards this idea that, okay, learning is participation. We do believe that learning happens in everyday life and whatever we do, participating as social beings. But then how do we shift the conversation to saying, well, what kinds of learning do we really want to promote and support? So it's not enough that young people are just participating on the internet, for example, but there are forms of participation that are leading to a broadened set of connections, to opportunity, to leveling up, to intergenerational relationships that we think are really important to signal. So it's not like there's participatory learning and non-participatory learning, right? So that's the dilemma with the term, I think. I think as our tools and our opportunities to connect to different people and affinity groups have proliferated, we've naturally started to develop strategies for segmenting our identities, for connecting with particular groups in particular ways through different platforms. And I think that's been a really interesting evolution of our digital culture. So if you look at a site like Facebook, it used to be youth-centered, and now it's kind of an everybody site. And so young people don't necessarily feel safe displaying their identities on Facebook in the same way that they might have in their early years, because it is a site that's being, reviewed by your elders and people who have power over you in new ways. So I think the issue is often framed in terms of private versus public, or how much do you share. But it really is becoming a much more granular and sophisticated process of selecting, which forms of publicity, which forms of identity, which forms of groups do you participate in what ways. And it's not so different from everyday life. Like, everybody knows that, we're multifaceted, and I'll dress a different way for a different social gathering than another. So it's a lot like that, is just to be clear about who the audience is, both in practice and in technical reality. So even though you think you're communicating with your friends on Facebook, it's in fact everybody who has insight into, and then starting to tailor, those groups and communications. And I think people realize that you have different identities for different audiences. So, for example, I think some of the most sophisticated digital users that I've talked to really understand that, they might start a Tumblr on a particular topic that may not have very high status among, their peers in real life or among the adults in their lives, and they're very careful to keep that Tumblr identity distinct and separate from these other kinds of identities, and that's, includes whether you use a different email address or whether there are any linkages between different sites. So, by all means, continue to use the internet as a space of play and exploration, but also be really smart about where that identity and that communication is circulating. Yeah, I think it's really challenging right now because there's so much competition for attention, so many different sites and platforms that people can share and publish in. So I do think that it's important to realize that getting recognition and attention is alchemy between doing really good work, understanding, how to publish and promote and, get recognized through more formal means like submitting to a competition or, working with badges or reputation schemes. But, maybe most importantly, it's about being embedded in a social community. And that social capital is the invisible glue that gets people really recognized, and really understanding that you have to work all three components. So you have to do excellent work. You have to, understand the gates and the, hurdles that could stand in your way or enable you to get recognition through more formal mechanisms. But most importantly, you have to invest in other people. And, you have to give love to get love. And I think that's the part that young people who are really successful navigating the digital world have a set of social and network building competencies that are really, really critical. A community of practice, now that is a word that has evolved and been in some ways in contention for many years. So when I was a graduate student back in the day, we thought of community of practice as really associated with a particular body of work, and the work of Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger in particular, that described how people came together with a shared practice, like butchers or seamstresses, that had expertise attached to it, that had people attached to it, where people were doing things together with a shared purpose, and that community was reproducing itself naturally over time, which included learning, and people would learn as part of their participation in that community of practice. And that was how the term originated and how many of us still think about it. Now, I think the term has come to mean a lot of different things, especially as it's been brought into more commercial and corporate settings where people are trying to engineer communities of practice in particular ways for particular kinds of productivity and team building kinds of efforts. And I think in that context, the term has definitely kept many of the valences of situated learning and learning through doing and through social connection, but it doesn't always include all of those connotations of a historical and culturally embedded kind of community of practice that I think it did in the early days. When we talk to young people who are very active digital producers, that's one of the first things they talk about is wanting to get good feedback from the right kinds of people for their work, because people recognize that it's that critical and well-informed feedback that is the only way that you really learn to get better at something. It's also one of the hardest things to get online. So there's this theoretic possibility of getting productive feedback, but a lot of platforms are designed with simple likes and star rating systems, commenting systems that aren't particularly well tuned for getting productive feedback. And that's why a lot of times we see digital creators really working on relationships that are specific to giving and getting feedback. So fan fiction writers who are very successful inevitably have an inner cohort of beta readers that they have a reciprocal relationship with, that they're at a level where they respect each other's abilities. So it's also not just about getting feedback, but getting feedback that's keyed to the right level, and really cultivating relationships that are centered around learning. Often we call them your personal learning network. So you have to cultivate those peers and those mentors who are really in that position. And it's not just about putting something on YouTube and getting loved and hated for it, but it's really about, again, focusing on those relationships or building a relationship to a community that has values around expertise. Now, sometimes you don't necessarily have to work that much on the individual, finding your beta reader or beta viewer. If you have a community that embodies really high values, strong values around productive feedback. And we do see that in some smaller scale communities or sub-communities within larger platforms that are really well moderated, that have really worked to cultivate that culture of productive feedback. So, for example, we've looked at communities ranging from Ravelry.com to, StarCraft and different fan fiction sites. And there are some communities often that have barriers to entry, like role-playing sites where, really everybody is giving and getting feedback in a productive way, and that's just the norm of everybody who's on the site. But it's much harder to maintain that culture in a wide open kind of platform. I think there definitely are both, design strategies on a technology layer as well as strategies for community moderating, development, and so on, facilitation that can really promote healthy, high-functioning communities of practice. Or, we think of our job as really developing that in terms of connected learning communities, because there are properties that really scaffold learning in communities and some communities that really aren't as well designed for it. So the help and feedback is one good example, is that you actually create genres of practice, affordances in the site that allow and encourage help and feedback. So, for example, one of the sites I studied, animemusicvideos.org, was a fan design site that was really optimized for that community. And they have a whole range of mechanisms for feedback and reviews, which range from competitions, so like formal things that people can submit to, which are really great for new people who haven't been recognized in the community, who think they can do really good work, to these thoughtful feedback templates that you can submit for any video, and a process where anybody can submit feedback, but the creator can choose to publicize what they want. And so there's a whole range of different mechanisms that encourage feedback. Every time you view a video, you're asked to provide feedback every time. So the site is constantly encouraging that level of communication and creating a culture where creators are really feel like their participation in the community includes thoughtful reflection on other people's work. So that's just one example. I think it's critical that learning doesn't end after you leave the formal education system, especially in this age when things are changing so fast from not just a technological perspective, but just the way that industries and jobs and so on are adapting. So we're not in an era right now where you can expect to have learned what you need to know for the rest of your career in school. Maybe we never were, but it's even more so today. And so I think what the opportunity is, though, that there are so many more open learning resources out there, and they're just growing by the day. So there's no excuse not to be a lifelong learner anymore, because for anything you want to learn, there's going to be a YouTube video, there's going to be a MOOC, there's going to be an FAQ, there's going to be a tutorial. If you want to become a developer, you can go to a 2-week coding boot camp. In fact, I've interviewed a lot of young people who have graduated and actually don't think they have the skills for the job they want. And they go online and they take a course in front-end web development or graphic design or data analysis or whatever it is. It may be a course that was never even offered in your school, or maybe you majored in something that wasn't exactly giving you the skills or the experience. But get that internship, do some learning. It's never going to stop. You always have to be a learner, and it's interesting and exciting to do that too, right? It's not just about getting the job. So I think there's a huge opportunity for young people to just continue to, fill in and make changes to their skill set and so on. And there are actually abundant resources to make that happen. I think it's a really both interesting and challenging time to be entering the wider world from your formal education, because the reality of the economic landscape and what it means to have a college degree for your job prospects and things like that have really, really changed, so that it's not enough just to be holding that degree anymore to get you where you want to be. You have to be active and entrepreneurial, and you have to be a learner and building connections and really continuing to value those relationships that you have now, that you're going to make in the future. And those relationships, plus that hunger and desire to learn, that's what's going to guarantee your success in life, not the fact that you've climbed that ladder the way everybody told you to. Nobody has laid out the path in advance. It's the people who are around you who are going to be your learning network for the rest of your life. And it's that ability to really stay connected and stay learning that's really going to keep you both happy and successful.